Welcome to Fighting for Freedom. I'm Janine Funke, German historian and science journalist, and over the last 4 episodes we have traveled across the former Soviet sphere of influence, from workers' uprising on June 17, 1953 in East Germany, to Poland's Solidarność movement and the Baltic Sea Revolution, to protests and ethnic conflicts in Kazakhstan and the South Caucasus, and finally to the politics of perestroika and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Along the way, one pattern has emerged again and again. Freedom cannot be taken for granted. Today, in our final episode, we turn to the country that has been present in the background of this entire podcast series, Ukraine. Ukraine was one of the core Soviet republics, a site of catastrophic famine, Nazi occupation, and the Holocaust, post-war reconstruction, and Soviet industrialization. It was also a place where late Soviet politics, dissident movements, and national aspirations took their own shape. Since independence in 1991, Ukrainians have repeatedly taken to the streets. During the Orange Revolution of 2004, in the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 14, for democracy, the rule of law, and a European future. Now we are almost 11 years into the Russian-Ukrainian war and 4 years into Russia's full-scale invasion. Russia explicitly justifies its war against Ukraine with distorted historical claims about the roots of Ukrainian statehood, about being one people in an alleged denazification. Following its independence, Ukraine has developed its own memory culture and politics, from Holodomor remembrance and decommunization laws to participation in the European World War II commemoration of May 8 or debates about ambivalent national heroes. Besides official historical narratives, also individual memories shape how Ukrainians interpret the present. At the same time, how other countries remember World War II, the Soviet Union, or their own struggle for independence shapes the way in which they understand the Russian aggression. To explore these topics for this final episode, I'm joined by 3 historians whose work connects scholarship, public debate, and the current war in different ways. All 3 are now working on a joint collaborative research project headed by Iuliia Skubytska at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. Stefanie Eisenhuth is a cultural historian who works on the history of state and post-socialism, divided Germany and memory cultures, and has written about German memory culture and Russia's war against Ukraine. Iuliia Skubytska is a historian of the Soviet Union and Ukraine, specializing on the history of childhood, oral history, and public history. She was also the director of the War Childhood Museum's Ukrainian office. Franziska Davies is a historian of Eastern and East Central Europe who has written extensively on Ukraine, German blind spots towards Eastern Europe, and the specifically anti-imperial character of contemporary Ukrainian nationalism. This episode will be designed as a roundtable, and I will guide you through the conversation. We will begin with one question to each of our guests about their research and then move through 3 layers: Ukraine and the Soviet Union, the Orange Revolution in Euromaidan, and Russia's full-scale invasion, which is also changing Europe today. Throughout, we will ask, what does it mean to fight for freedom, and what is at stake when history itself becomes a battlefield? So this podcast episode will be designed as a round table, and I will guide you through the conversation. We will begin with one question to each of our guests about their research, and then move through 3 layers. We talk about the Ukraine in the Soviet Union, the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, and Russia's full-scale invasion, which is also changing Europe today. Throughout, we will ask, what does it mean to fight actually for freedom, and what is at stake when history itself becomes a battlefield? So, Stefanie, your work looks at memory cultures in Germany and more recently at how German never again debates respond to Russia's war against Ukraine. If you zoom out from that work, what has surprised you most about the way German and European memory cultures have reacted actually since 2022?
Well, first of all, I guess personally, I was, and of course still am, impressed by the bravery and courage of Ukrainians. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I was also pleasantly surprised about this huge wave of solidarity and help in Germany, but at the same time also shocked by the very openly shown sympathy for Russia. So that's the personal perspective. And as a historian studying Germany and memory culture, maybe three observations. First of all, the extent to which we can still observe an East-West divide with regard to German memory culture. So we can still see how different historical experiences, but also different narratives are shaping people's perception today and affecting the way in which they interpret Russia's war against Ukraine. Second, I was, of course, not surprised that history was used as an argument. I guess we're all familiar with that phenomenon. But how often opposite demands can be justified with the exact same historical reasoning or reference. And that's where, like you just mentioned, the popular never again phrase. And that has become like this example for me in that regard, because it illustrates it perfectly. What exactly should never happen again? Like wars in general, or genocide, or anti-Semitism, or authoritarian rule, or Nazism? Because based on what we think we can and should learn from the past, so how we respond, how like our personal answer to that decides what we think would be an appropriate response now in order to achieve or prevent a certain future from happening. So I think that was for me a very thought-provoking observation, because if I believe, for example, the most important lesson from World War II is to never pick up a weapon again, no matter what, I will, of course, argue differently than someone who's convinced that the most important lesson should be to actively stop crimes against humanity from happening again. So that was pretty much also what the article you mentioned was about. And third, but think I'm going to pause here because I'm sure that Franziska can say a lot more about that. It's the many blind spots in German memory culture with regard to Eastern Europe that have become very painfully obvious over the last years in particular.
Yeah, we can talk to you now about this, Franziska. You argued that Ukraine was a blind spot long time in German debates. How does this affect actually the perception of Europe now after the full-scale invasion and even before?
I think some things have changed after the full-scale invasion. So for many Germans, Ukraine was a complete blind spot. And we will talk about the Revolution of Dignity, so we'll probably talk more about that topic there. But for me, this became so obvious during that time. I was not actually working on Ukraine at that time. I was so fascinated by the Revolution of Dignity that I started working on Ukraine after that. But there were so many in German society, in German media, in German politics, everywhere, basically, in every sphere of society, just very much buying into these Russian propaganda narratives about Maidan. And this has an extremely long history of Russocentrism in Germany, and it's connected to the centuries, basically, of Russian-German colonialism at the expense of the peoples, regions, and country between Russia and Germany. So you could say this is something that started in the late 18th century with the Prussian-Russian Austrian partitions of Poland, Lithuania, and it was bloody before that, but it's kind of the most brutal climax in the Hitler-Stalin Pact and the joint occupation of Eastern Central Europe between 1939 and 1941. And even after Germany was defeated, this kind of fixation on Russia continued. So even when kind of German political imperialism in Eastern Central Europe kind of died, thankfully, with this end of the Second World War and Germany's defeat. This kind of fixation on Russia for many reasons, there was, conflating the Soviet Union with Russia, and this fixation with Russian literature and culture has to do with this kind of colonial past and with Russia's colonial domination, not only of Ukraine, but in particular of Ukraine, but also of other countries, which used to belong to the Russian Empire and after this to the Soviet Union. And this just very much shaped the perception. So there were, I don't even actually think the knowledge about Russia isn't necessarily that strong, that much greater in Germany, quite to the contrary. but there are very strong cliches, and some of them quite positive, associated with Russia. The wide region of Siberia, and of course completely blacking out why this became and how this became part of Russia. That's also connected to colonial violence, why Siberia, for example, is part of the Russian Federation today, literature, Tolstoy, all these blah, blah, blah. And Ukraine, there was basically nothing. And I think for many people that changed in 2022 because they were, as Stefanie said, fascinated by the bravery, other things we saw, humor in spite of the full-scale invasion. And so we do now have a part of German society really very committed to Ukraine, and I think also shocked by their own ignorance. How could I not see that this country was always part of Europe and that it has a great culture and great people? But of course, we can ask ourselves, what does that say about us? And as Stefanie was also pointing out, there are other parts of society, other parts in politics and media and culture, it's also very strong, where there's still this kind of Russophilia and still an unwillingness to see Russia for what it is today and what it actually has been for quite a while. It's not like Russian colonialism is something new. But for some, I think it's just tied to politics. If you're far right wing, then Russia is a model. But I think for others, that they still don't really want to let go of this idea of a high Russian culture, a part of Russia which is not like Putin, is also because it would mean reckoning with your own mistakes and your own blind spots. And this is something which takes courage. And I can attest to this personally because I was also not free of Russocentrism as an academic. And so this has also been a learning process for me over the last couple of years. It's not exactly fun to deal with your own blind spots and how you yourself base some of your even academic thinking on false assumptions.
So, Julia, you have another perspective on this because you were born and raised in Ukraine, and you specialize in your research on the history of the Soviet Union, especially on childhood and oral history. So let's turn now to understand a little bit better the memory culture on history. So first question to you, based on your research, how do people in Ukraine actually remember their Soviet childhood? I assume this is quite a difficult topic.
Well, we are talking about today. I think this is something that is not really being discussed much. Because of the war, I think everything associated with Russia became a very contested matter. I think many Ukrainians went through some quite painful realizations about what they were a part of. And I think it's very important that we kind of find our way through this. Because it's about building an inclusive society, it's about supporting each other, and it's about recognizing that no one is guilty of being born in the Soviet Union. That was not exactly a choice. The question is what we do with this heritage, with these experiences. Many of them were quite positive, but that doesn't mean that the whole project was the greatest idea ever. It also doesn't mean that people who had these positive experiences cannot be loyal Ukrainian citizens.
We dive now into a little bit more into the history of Ukraine, and maybe to start with placing Ukraine a little bit in the broader story of the whole podcast, where we talked about East Germany, Poland, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus. So maybe we can start talking a little bit about what was actually specific about Ukraine inside the Soviet Union.
Okay, so one of the big parts of my book is going to be about the end of the Soviet Union. So from my perspective, what made for Ukraine special in the Soviet Union is that even Moscow could not imagine a Soviet Union without Ukraine. So when Ukraine declared independence in August 1991, and when after it was confirmed by the population in a nationwide referendum at the end and in the winter, in December 1991, and then to the shock of many in Moscow, which also tells you something about this kind of colonial mindset. Why are they voting for independence? We're one people. And then it was kind of clear the thing was over. And because when the Baltic states declared independence, there were those in Moscow who said, okay, fine, maybe without the Baltic states, but not without Ukraine. I think that's one very important point, which also to an extent explains the why Ukraine is in the center of Russia's colonial obsession. It's not the only place it kind of claims as part of its empire, of course, but it's very central to it. So this is basically neo-colonial war. And I think the second one, but I'd love to hear what my colleagues think about this, is that on the one hand, the Ukrainian Communist Party, I mean, we have to remember that Ukraine, contrary to what you will hear from Russia propaganda narratives, but also from so-called good Russians, Ukraine did not voluntarily enter the Soviet Union. So there was a declaration of independence, Ukrainian declaration of independence in January of 1918. And it became clear very much that despite the Bolsheviks kind of claiming we're breaking from this past, of this imperial past of great Russian chauvinism, and we're for the self-determination of nations, it became clear very much, not only in Ukraine, but particularly in Ukraine, that this was not true, that they really did also claim Ukraine for this new socialist state they wanted to create. So they were actually, in this respect, they were moving in this tradition of Russian imperialism, of Russian colonialism. But despite, I mean, not despite this, it's not a contradiction, but as the Soviet Union evolved, the Ukrainian Communist Party became kind of the junior party of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I mean, interestingly, we don't have a Russian Communist Party of the Soviet Union. We just have the various non-Russian republics, or each have their own Ukrainian, Kazakh, whatever Communist Party. But Russia does not have a Russian Communist Party. There you can already see that the Soviet Union was actually also a Russian colonial project, because the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was de facto the Russian one, but it wasn't named that way. So, but nonetheless, Ukraine was the second most important kind of apparatus as far as communist parties goes in the Soviet Union. And sometimes it is kind of used as an argument, which I don't find at all convincing, that somehow it can't really have been Russian colonial because the Ukrainians kind of participated. But actually, at the same time, the center of power was still Moscow. So having a career as a Ukrainian politician in Moscow, or in general in the Soviet Union, required certain things like cultural Russification, not only kind of a loyalty to Moscow, but also cultural Russification. And the second thing is that I think Ukraine plays this interesting role of, on the one hand, being the second most important communist party, on the other hand, being the victim of some of the most severe Soviet Russian colonial violence. So if you look at the state-created famine in the 1930s, which in Kazakhstan, but also in Ukraine, took on a kind of genocidal dimension. If you look at how actually Ukrainians were one of the first people in the Soviet Union, even before the so-called Great Terror, to be persecuted as nationalists. So it's this kind of a double role. So on the one hand, yes, second most important. If you paid a certain price, you could have a good career as a Ukrainian in Moscow. But at the same time, some of the worst kind of colonial crimes of the Soviet Union happened in Ukraine. Of course, we also have Kazakhstan, so I don't want to have some kind of a hierarchy of victimhood. But I think, again, this actually ties back to the centrality of Ukraine for ideas of the Russian Empire. So at the one hand, you need it, so you create loyal communists. On the other hand, if the center feels threatened, there's a huge amount of violence.
Yeah, just add to this, just more complementary things. First of all, the moment when Bogdan Khmelnytsky added the part of left bank Ukraine to Russia was actually the moment when Muscovy turned into the Russian Empire. So literally it is becoming an empire because it is extending itself into Ukraine. It's not just imagination. It is really grounded in history of relationship between Russian Empire in its different shapes and various leaders who were in charge of certain political situations on the territories that in the 20th century became Ukraine as the independent state. I would also add that this proclamation of independence in 1918 made Soviet authorities very suspicious of Ukrainians. And this was a consistent politics throughout the whole existence of the USSR. And the crimes that Franziska was talking about, they are partly originating from the fact that Soviet authorities are very well aware and are afraid, in a way. It also shows consistency among Ukrainians.
Also the resistance, the declaration of independence followed by armed resistance against the Red Army from 1918 onwards in Ukraine, which went on for 3 years at least. Yeah. So then this kind of memory shaped the decision makers in Moscow. I think this is the first time I've ever had a disagreement with Iuliia, because I would say it didn't start with Ukraine, just because I think our listeners don't know Bogdan Khmelnytsky. So Iuliia was talking about the 17th century and this kind of alliance between central Ukraine and Muscovy in the 17th century. I would say it starts even earlier with Kazan and Astrakhan. So what is nowadays Tatarstan, when these kind of Muslim people are subdued by this Russian Orthodox pre-modern state. I would say that's the moment when it turns into an empire. But I would absolutely agree that Ukraine becomes also such an obsession. I think I would probably argue that starts in the 19th century with the emergence of a national Ukrainian movement. Because then Ukraine not only confronts the empire, it also confronts, like, Russian nationalists, national imperialists feel threatened in their own identity. And this is when this whole idea, which we now hear from Putin and his supporters and from large parts of Russian society, that we are one people, it's actually a colonial myth of the 19th century in reaction to, like, a small group of people in the beginning starting to become interested in Ukrainian and Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture. And this is very early on, I would say, construed as a threat not only to the imperial state, but also to Russian identity.
I will add here, I actually do agree with Franziska, but I was not talking about the practice of colonial conquest, which of course date back to the conquest of Kazan. I'm talking about the change in the name.
Yeah, I see. Mm-hmm.
It starts being called the empire.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. That's like 1721 or something, I think.
Yeah, like it's more about self-realization. They finally give themselves the name that we are an empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But of course, yes, the imperial conquest of the Duchess of Muscovy date way back.
Maybe to return to the initial question and how it connects to our project, I think asking for Ukraine's history is already part of a process because since we've learned from what Franziska just said, like how much Ukraine was denied its own history. So one part about Ukraine's path to independence is to first of all rediscover or discover its own history and to shape an identity based on that history. And so to understand yourself as Ukraine and what does that mean, etc. So that is very much part of the process of this path to independence that we are studying, and that's very much tied to a lot of discussions nowadays.
I imagine that in the Soviet times, the creation of a certain memory on Ukrainian history was like dominated by the Soviet perspective. How is it today? So is there a process of regaining a known narrative, and how is it like intergenerational shaped? Like, do people have certain like different narratives on Ukrainian's history, or is it like turning into one narrative that is kind of and creation of an own narrative independently from the old Soviet narrative? So how do you see that, especially Iuliia? You are also researching on memory, culture, and personal memory. So how would you actually describe the state of this narrative on the long history of Ukraine?
Well, there is a joke that if you ask a historian a question, the short answer will be it is complicated. So I guess we can move past that one. It's in flux because, well, there are different generations in Ukrainian society, and we all grew up with different history books. For example, I went to school during the period when we were changing, moving, like it was the 90s. So part of knowledge we were taking from Soviet history books, part of information we were learning from the newly issued ones, which also were developed very fast. So our whole school curricula was changing. As a result, it was a mosaic of bits and pieces, and it really heavily depended on the teachers. And a lot of our parents were in a way confused, I would say, because it was also so close to perestroika, the time during which many Soviet citizens for the first time learned about the crimes of the Soviet authorities and had to rethink their relationship with this country. So to some extent, I think this is continuing till now. We're still having discussions about the textbooks because right now our textbooks are covering very contemporary events, the Russo-Ukrainian war since 2014, but we're still discussing how to tell that story. So it's an ongoing process, but one thing that is the strength of Ukrainian society, I think, is that there is a lot of discussion and there is a lot of participation in that discussion. So I think the most important thing right now is moderation, our ability to find our way towards a nuanced narrative.
I would just like to add to what Iuliia just said that my impression is that very often these kind of memory debates are portrayed as something very unique and oh my gosh, Ukrainian society is so torn by like different memory cultures. Actually, we're experiencing not the same, of course, but similar memory struggles over here in Germany. Like, we also have different memory cultures. Like, for example, a lot of our students here have to kind of navigate between what they are hearing at home about the GDR, how their grandparents experienced it, and what they've read in school books. So while their grandparents maybe focus on the happy holidays they spent at the Baltic Sea, their textbooks focus on Stalinist repression in the 1950s. So German students have to deal with these different stories, these different narratives about the same time as well. And so I think reconciling these different narratives and understanding that none of them are completely wrong, explain how they are related, how they enable each other. I think that is something that every society has to deal with, that does not just have one memory culture. And I think that's rather a rare case. I mean, in Germany, we also have different memory cultures with regard to World War II, like Iuliia said about Ukraine earlier. So we also have to deal with that and find a way to unite collective and cultural memory and to find common ground with regard to our values and how we want to think about the past and what it should teach us for the future. So I just think very often Ukraine is portrayed as this like very like torn apart society, which I think is interesting, especially in Germany, where we're actually experiencing similar discussions and could maybe learn a lot from each other through dialogue. Exactly.
Maybe, well, this is a European discussion looking at the 20th century. So not only Eastern Europe, also Southwestern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greek. Like there are a lot of countries that experienced Second World War, experienced dictatorship, and have contested memories. And one big question we ask in the podcast is the role of uprisings and revolutions in these regions or in these countries during the Soviet period. So Ukraine has had various revolutions or various uprisings. One important one is the Orange Revolution 2004 and the Maidan protests in 2013. So can you maybe explain a little bit how are these protests actually remembered today and what is their significance in Ukrainian culture today or memory culture today?
I feel actually more this is a question for Iuliia, but I can say what I think and then Iuliia can correct me or add or something. I think we actually have a third Maidan or a first Maidan with the Revolution on Granite in 1990. And then 2004, the Orange Revolution, and then the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14. I think not always, but very often they're remembered as kind of these three Maidans. And also, my impression is, but I have to say this is not my area of research. So this is more like what I gather from what I read and when I talk to people. That is also to some extent tied to generations. So kind of each generation has their Maidan. The Maidan of 1990 was kind of the student protests in the late Soviet Ukraine, also for Ukrainian independence. But you also had this kind of parts of the intelligentsia, I would say, sometimes argued we didn't really fight for independence. I think that's actually not true, but it's also because I'm working exactly on the independence movement, so I can kind of see the trajectory of this kind of resistance during the Soviet time and then how it contributed to the end of the Soviet Union. But this kind of idea, we didn't have a mass uprising, we didn't have a big revolution where we fought and where we really kind of managed to fight off the imperial yoke of Moscow. And in a way, that's what happened in 2013-14, and sometimes even the war now. Some people conceptualize it as a war for Ukrainian independence, so that it's kind of in this, you could see Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity of 2014, actually more in the tradition of the Prague Spring or something, because of course it was also tied to internal Ukrainian politics, and very often in the West and in Germany in particular, it was kind of portrayed, which was completely a false narrative and also actually a very colonial narrative. It's not really about anything really to do with Ukraine, but rather it's kind of a struggle between Russia and America and blah, blah, blah. That's, of course, it's all nonsense. It was tied to Yanukovych, who became president, so he was the one who was ousted by protesters because of the results for him were falsified in 2004. Then was democratically elected as a president in 2010, I think it was, right? And then actually, sorry to say this, even for Ukrainian standards at that time, was really corrupt, so really enriched himself and his family, and also very authoritarian. So this was kind of the idea of if we don't resist, and I think that's what actually happened on 2013-14, we'll end up like Belarus. So this is really a fight for democracy. And also, and that's why Revolution of Dignity, so that we can have a normal, dignified life with the rule of law, with a freedom, no corruption. But I mean, Ukrainians are realists. Less corruption first, and then at some point, no corruption. But definitely not Yanukovych and his regime. But of course, that's also tied to this dimension of Moscow, because Yanukovych was, of course, Moscow's favorite candidate. You know, his refusal to sign the agreement with the European Union, which sparked the protests. He denied the signature, which many in Ukraine had waited for, even from the so-called pro-Russian parties. He denied the signature after meeting with Putin. So, you know, not far-fetched to say there was pressure and possibly also the offer simply of money. So I think it's both. It's kind of it was a revolution or an uprising for freedom, but it was also an anti-colonial uprising. And what I understand, to some extent as an observer, because since then I've been traveling regularly to Ukraine, I think the Revolution of Dignity had a huge impact. And that this kind of, also as a kind of really there's until Maidan or until Revolution of Dignity, and then there's post. And that's not only because Russia attacked, but also because something within Ukrainian society changed. And I think that's more important, that what changed within Ukrainian society, becoming more liberal, more pluralistic, more democratic. Iuliia, you probably don't remember, but you should tell me what you once told me, that the Orange Revolution is also such a poignant example of how differently Russia and Ukraine developed after 1991. I thought it was really clever. I even cited it in my introduction, but I, of course, put your name. Because in 2004 in Russia, there was Beslan. So police forces stormed a school where people were being held hostage. Loads of children and civilians were shot by these security forces. And in the end, nothing really happened. Society kind of accepted it. And at the same time in Ukraine, people managed to go to force a democratic election. Very often in the mental maps of the West, we put Russia and Ukraine together. But actually, after 1991, the fascinating thing is how rapidly the difference begins in terms of political liberalization and also in terms of how societies develop. And one last point, because I've been talking too much, talking about Russocentrism also in academia, about which we could do our own podcast or podcast series, actually. I was a student in 2004, and I asked a German professor, because I didn't know anything about Ukraine, I just saw in the, for me, it was also a blind spot. I just saw these newspaper reports about the Orange Revolution. And I asked, what's going to happen? And he said to me, it's going to fall apart into East and West. And that just tells you how these kind of cliches and stereotypes about Ukraine were actually also very widespread and still are to some extent in academia, because we also have this tradition of focusing on Russia, or even if we focus on Ukraine, be very much influenced by Russian narratives.
I guess I'll just add to this story about the differences between Russian and Ukrainian society. First of all, Russian society never invested an effort like that into protesting what the authorities were doing. That is why we often have a hard time talking about resistance, because Russian protesters, people who participated, like liberal Russians, they often claim that, but we put an effort and we didn't manage. But the problem is when you start and how much effort. And Orange Revolution, I participated in it. It was a month of daily work of going to the street in winter. It is an enormous effort. We are now remembering Orange Revolution as this kind of nice thing, on the contrast to what happened during the Revolution of Dignity. I think most people who participated have rather positive memories, but they are positive in comparison. My health, for example, was definitely affected by that month. And when we started it, the first day when my university took to the streets, we didn't know whether the army would get involved. What I'm trying to say is that Orange Revolution is often presented as something that we had it easy, or it could be compared maybe to the protests in Russia. But here it is very much about Ukrainian society's sensitivity to what will go wrong. We wanted to prevent the president whom we considered unfit and whom we considered has corrupted the election process from coming to power. And then when this person came to power, Viktor Yanukovych, he was in power just for 3 years. Let's think about Vladimir Putin. And we already had something very, very different from the Orange Revolution to take him away. It's also about preventive action or early action. I'm not sure we've been thinking about Belarus too much, frankly speaking, but it was about some kind of survival and where we want to go. And one more thing that I would add in relation to, again, Beslan, for example, is that the Revolution of Dignity developed in several stages, and it actually could have faded away if Viktor Yanukovych did not order the beating of a small number of students that stayed on the Maidan. This is when he received hundreds of thousands of people next day on the streets. And this is a very, very striking contrast to Beslan, where nothing even close to that happened, ever.
We've now been talking about the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity being turning points in history, and I guess we could also tell them as a continuous struggle based on the same values, as a continuous struggle for democracy, the rule of law, closer ties with and a clearer path towards Europe. So I guess in this way, they kind of build on each other. They are triggered by different events. They all have their separate context, but I think they are grounded in the same values, and that's very important to underline.
Maybe when we stay by the turning points in history, I guess you would agree that this full-scale invasion after 2022 is a turning point in Ukrainian history. So how is this war that we see today, since a few years, also a war on contested memory?
Well, I would argue that, especially if we are talking about contested memory, we should be dating back to 2014. Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014, so it's been a decade. We have a generation of children in Ukraine who went to school without living in a peaceful country, and that's horrible. But also, 2014 became the time of the major revision of Ukrainian cultural politics, and Petro Poroshenko, who became president, I think it was 2014. I remember voting in New York. He was very serious about the cultural aspect of politics, and we really needed that at the time, because before that, there was something very good, which is memory politics, but also just self-reflection on who we are as a nation. It was more of an organic process. So it was developing in a very disorganized way. At least the state was not really intruding into it, except for Viktor Yushchenko. But even with his policies, he made a lot to bring the memory and history of Holodomor into the Ukrainian public discussion. And yet, those who resisted this process could do that. Let's put it this way. Petro Poroshenko did some really helpful things. He established state institutions which were supporting people who wanted to produce Ukrainian culture and talk about Ukrainian memory. So finally, Ukrainian artistic community, to some extent the civil society, they started receiving more support from the state, more funding. We're talking about the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. We're talking about Ukrainian Book Institute that was supporting Ukrainian publishing industry because it was really suffering from the competition with Russia. It was very difficult. We're talking about Ukrainian Institute that started working on Ukrainian public politics abroad and so on. So it became a much more structured story, and Ukrainian Institute of Remembrance also received support. It is also the time when, at the state level, Ukraine started rethinking its relationship with Russia very straightforwardly, I would say. Early on, this rethinking was more focused on the Soviet Union, and what changed with the full-scale invasion was that it became Russia. It was like, no, it's not just our past. We are talking about the very present aggressor who has been persistently present in our history for several centuries, and this relationship has not been very beneficial for us. Let's put it like in this very mild terms.
When we talked earlier today, you said how the way Ukrainians remember and even name the revolution of dignity, and how much different the Russian disinformation about Maidan is, and that in this way, like narrative-wise, we have to start in 2014. Do you remember? Like,
the evolution of dignity.
yeah, and how it is tied to how Russia today is justifying its denazification, it's so called.
Oh yes, that story. Well, Russia justifies its denazification by what happened during the Maidan, which is problematic on multiple levels. So first of all, the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was chosen in fair, transparent elections. Nobody contested his victory. So the argument that Ukrainian government is illegitimate, which is one of the claims of President Putin, just doesn't stand any critique. However, the discourse about this illegitimate Ukrainian government that Russia just doesn't recognize, it dates back to Maidan. The only problem is that what happened during Maidan was actually a realization of the constitutional right of Ukrainian people. It is, in many constitutions, actually, the people have this right to change the government and to use different means to do that. So, and Petro Poroshenko also was elected afterwards, not as a result. So none of this is a claim that stands any critique. But of course, there was also a claim that the Nazis basically came to power, and that was the justification for Russia's attack in 2014. And I was in the US then, and I heard this argument all the time. And at some point, I remember like a colleague of mine presenting it, and I just looked at who were the people who were the ministers. And so at that time, when Russia was arguing that, Ukraine for the first time had a right-wing populist party entering the parliament with something around 5%. They barely passed the threshold. And they had one minister in the government, and he was the Minister of Agriculture. This was all that could be remotely, because the Svoboda party they're not Nazis. They are right-wing, they are populist, and so on, but they're far away from Nazis. But this was all the strong right-wing presence that we had.
Can I just add one thing to this question of the role of memory and kind of historical narratives? I think it's always important to first say that history just does not matter here. I know it's weird for a historian to say that, but it's completely irrelevant. So even if Ukraine had kind of fallen from the sky in 1991 in its current borders and became an internationally recognized state, then that's it. Over. It's a question of international law. And in that sense, it's completely clear-cut what happened. We're all historians. We all know what would happen if we started arguing if an invasion is somehow justified because the people in power have a certain idea of history. It would just be the end of the European international security order, which, this principle, you don't change borders through violence. So I also think it's very important to stress in this context that this is not just about Ukraine. Of course, it's an attack on Ukraine, and of course, the people of Ukraine are the ones who are suffering under this war, and some of them who are living under genocidal Russian occupation. But if Russia succeeds, it will be the destruction of the European security order, which keeps us safe. So it's also a war against that. What Iuliia was saying about these narratives, I also think it's very telling. Don't look at the content of the narrative, but just the structure. It's very old. It's all based on this colonial assumption, and that's also why some people, this would go too far now to discuss this now, but the specificity of Russian colonialism in Ukraine and towards Belarus is that it claims to some extent sameness. We are one people. There's still, which I think is the absolute central thing, there's a power imbalance, of course, like historically in the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, and also now, of course, there's always a hierarchy. There's always a cultural hierarchy. So Russians are at the top, and Russians are the one who are supposed to have power. But this makes it hard for some people to recognize it as colonialism because they always think of this kind of supposedly classical Western imperialism where there's a clear-cut othering from English nation towards India and so on. But this is really an aspect of Russian colonialism. And the narrative is always, since the 19th century, that there's an outsider who is dividing Russia and Ukraine. And so in the 19th century, it's the Poles. Then during the war of re-imperialization, we very often call it the Russian Civil War. But I mean, if you invade Ukraine after Ukrainian independence declaration in 1918, it's not really a Russian civil war. So already here you see in just the very basic terms we use how much we are influenced by Russocentric narratives. But then it was kind of the outsiders, the Germans who are, prepping up Ukraine. And then in the Second World War, it's the German-sponsored Ukrainian Nazis. And so now it's NATO or America or whoever, or some Nazis who are dividing this supposedly historic union between two people who have always been the same. And I think that to focus more on the structural element shows us there's a tradition here, a long tradition. To recognize that, I think, is also sometimes very important to stress in the German or Western context, where you still have these mad narratives about, it's NATO, it's America or whatever. So for one answer for me is now always, I'd actually just had such a crazy event in Berlin, a absolutely high-class conference. And then there was this absolute mad talk about NATO, about the Russia-Ukrainian war, and it was called a proxy war and blah, blah, blah. I think one of the rare topics where you hear similar narrative in like East German little towns where 40% of the people vote for the AfD and high-class conferences with left-wing academics. I mean, it's quite wild to hear the same narratives, but you do. And then it's always about NATO. And one thing I think one has to say to kind of break through this prism of historical narratives is to say, so the Russian occupational forces are abducting Ukrainian children to Russia and Russifying them. And you are telling me this has something to do with the 2008 summit of NATO countries. I mean, really. And the second thing, I think, is to say, but they say it's about America, they say it's about NATO, they say they feel threatened by NATO. Yes, but this is an old narrative structure. There's always an outsider, and the role of the outsider changes, but the narrative stays the same, and it's a narrative to legitimize colonial dominance.
I think Franziska brought up a very important point, and it is about the fact that Ukrainian occupied territories are not ruled the same way as Russian territories. Children are not just Russified, they're kidnapped from their parents. Let's start with that. Russian military get into people's homes and take away children, and then they are very underfed. They lose a ton of rights. There was recently a first case in Russia of a woman who was foster parent. She was selling children. And these are the topics that we are not bringing up, but children in this situation lose a ton of protection. We are talking about the camps and so on. A ton of children cannot be traced. So all the dark things that are probably happening to a part of Ukrainian children who were abducted, it will be very difficult to prove. But assuming that would be normal, given what we know about Epstein and so on, these things do happen. And they happen to children who are more protected than children who are taken by the military away. We're talking about crazy levels of sexual violence towards people of different ages, different genders, and so on. We are talking about Russian military establishing torture chambers in the smallest villages. Every occupied village has a torture chamber, at least one. So we are not talking here about, the happy reunion of one people. No, it's a very different ruling regime.
I would like to just add a very brief example from Germany, how Russia is using history in order to shape political practices in the present, like preparing for a symposium last week on Soviet monuments in Germany. I was looking through a few books here in our library, and there was one beautifully designed photo book, like glossy paper, and so very nice. And first of all, it was the title that struck me because it used the term liberators for the Soviet army in when they were coming to Germany. Then when you open that book, on the third page, you see who funded it. It was Gazprom and the Russian Federation. And if you look a little bit further, there are not a lot of nice photos, of course, how German, but not only Germans, are interacting with the Soviet monuments. So you see a lot of Soviet flags being waved. You see kids in Soviet uniforms it was not written there on the 8th or 9th of May at these monuments. You see the night wolves arriving. So you see a lot of very problematic things in these photos without any comment, without any explanation, just happy people celebrating the liberation. And in the preface by Matthias Platzek, a German politician, you can read that he's very, very sad how current politics are intermingling and disturbing the nice relationship between Germany and Russia, which is built on this idea of liberation and punishing Russia now with evil sanctions, of course exaggerating a little bit, but this is basically the narrative. They liberated Germany, so we have to be grateful. Grateful means no sanctions, no matter what they are doing. So this is a very, very clear example of how, first of all, they're spreading a narrative. Second of all, how they are claiming the entire Soviet history basically as Russian history. And third, how they are legitimizing current politics with history, basically saying no matter what we do, no matter how awful it is what we do, you need to stay calm, be grateful, and buy our cheap gas. So I think that's a very clear example how these topics are connected and affecting not just the war, but also how they're trying to influence other countries through these kind of narratives.
Franziska said that this war is not about history. It's actually international law. So Ukraine is a legitimate country and we should not be argued by history. But certainly my last question to you is, how do you think history can actually help, or how should European memory culture actually look like based on history, so that we don't fall for this kind of propaganda, for this kind of narrative, so that we can find a democratic narrative on the 20th century that would help us actually prevent violence, war, and all of that? Well, that's a big question, but what role does history actually play in all of that?
I wouldn't overestimate the power of history, which is depressing, or the power of historical narratives. I'm not a specialist on democracies, but I think the most important thing is democratic institutions, the rule of law, and protecting them. And I guess maybe in some ways that is connected to historical memories, because this is actually also something that Germans could learn from Ukraine. I think some of the reactions of Germany towards Ukraine can also be explained that Germans never really did fight for freedom and democracy, with the exception of the people in Eastern Germany who took to the streets in 1989. But there's not this kind of history of a successful liberation struggle. Nazi Germany ended because others liberated Germany, and it took a long time, and it was quite scandalous when a German president, for the West German president, at the beginning of the 1980s said it was actually a liberation. That's maybe one point. But if we do talk about historical narratives and how to counter them, because of course they are very powerful, and of course somehow as historians we have to react to them, and this is more like what my experience has been. So after the start of the full-scale invasion, a good year, maybe longer, the most common media request was, this is what Putin says about Ukraine. Can you explain to us why it's wrong? And of course, it's very, of course I can. It's quite easy. I always said this thing about international law first, and then I would counter Putin. But after a while, I found that very depressing, because it's still kind of the aggressor and still the imperial narrative which is defining the terms and the narratives by which we write about Ukrainian history, for example. And I now think, for me as a historian, it's much more important. It's an ongoing process of how to create our own narratives, and not only to counter imperial narratives, but to really try to, on the basis of our source material, develop other narratives which tell a different story, which very often tell a story which has been marginalized before in the writing of history. And this is also true in general for the history of Eastern and Eastern Central Europe. And it's also to do with Germany's own colonial past in these regions. We should, I think, really try to reflect on our own, how we ourselves have been influenced by this kind of hierarchy of knowledges, and that's by a hierarchy of languages, which originated in colonial and imperial contexts, and to really try to write a more inclusive history, not just of Ukraine, but of Eastern and Eastern Central Europe in general. And I think also automatically lead to a better history and a more critical history of the Russian Empire. Because in Germany, for me, the person who really spelled out word for word what was going to happen in Ukraine in December 2021 was Anna Veronika Wendland, who all her life has worked on Ukraine. And for some reason, and I don't think it's a coincidence, she was equipped like no other to exactly describe what Russia was going to do. And many colleagues who specialized more on Russia completely underestimated it, even thought, oh, it's not going to happen. And I think this is also because of this lack of the perspective of the colonized. If you include the perspectives of the colonized, you will understand the colonizer better.
I think my wish for European memory culture very much ties in with what Franziska just said. Like, I think the first step would be to listen to each other, because I feel like we've not been doing that enough, and accept the fact that Europe does not have one memory culture, and that this is actually good, that we can develop an European memory culture as a dialogue. But it needs to be a respectful dialogue where everyone has a saying, which is not dominated by just the Western narrative. How to counter disinformation, I think the first and most important part would be to actually be informed and stay informed. Like, for example, to know while we are chanting "never again" at demonstrations in Berlin, people in Russia are chanting "we can repeat it" or "to Berlin." And I think many people over here in Berlin do not know that. So I think that would be the first step to actually be informed about these things that are developing elsewhere.
Actually, as a historian, it's quite interesting. In the US, for example, history departments, they are very wary of contemporary history because as a historian, you need at least 30 years. When it becomes shorter, for American tradition, it becomes like maybe anthropology or whatever. Like I remember a friend of mine joking that we are not journalists, come on. So actually, in a way, on the one hand, this obsession and trust into the fact that something happened, I don't know, in the beginning of the 20th century, 2 centuries ago, or 80 years ago, that this is still a legitimate reason for action right now, it's something that should be critically analyzed. And on the other hand, as a historian, one thing I want to say is maybe we should start recognize that something has actually ended. In the meantime, I do believe that history, at least the way I see it used now, it's more about the work of historian as an archaeologist. So looking at the roots of what is happening. Has something like that happened before? When you study contemporary Russia, historical knowledge is helpful, first of all, because they are obsessed about history, but also because many patterns that are being used in the rhetoric of Russian authorities, we've seen that before. Like, they are really nothing new. And that's why, for example, at the end of 2021, I was feeling very, very uncomfortable because I've been seeing something unfolding, and I had a strong feeling that I took several courses on that already in a different context, in a bit different geography. And the fact that it was completely denied by people whom I thought also should have learned that at school, even if they were not historians at the university, was really disturbing. So it's very interesting how, on the one hand, we are dealing with this trust into legitimacy of the past and amazing forgetfulness about that past. Guys, this doesn't work. You've tried, this just doesn't. But no, for whichever reasons, we need to repeat that road. As historians, we still can take a position and critically analyze what is happening now in the way that we think about our past as well.
Well, thank you very much for your last words, Iuliia, and thank you all three for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What we've heard in this conversation and across this whole series is that the longing for freedom and independence in Eastern Europe has always been tied on how societies imagine themselves and how they tell their stories. Who is being remembered as a victim or hero, whose suffering is recognized and whose violence is named, and whose voices remain in the margins. I would like to thank my guests, Stefanie Eisenhuth, Iuliia Skubytska, and Franziska Davies, for sharing their insights, and all the historians who joined us throughout this series. I'm Janine Funke, and this was Fighting for Freedom. Thank you for listening and for taking the time to join us and taking a critical look at the significance of history in the here and now.